Picture this. You wake up one morning in 12,000 BC. You stretch, your joints crack like dry twigs, and you think to yourself, well, statistically speaking, I should already be dead. That's the myth we've all absorbed somewhere along the way. Ancient humans, we're told, dropped like flies before they hit 30. Grandparents didn't exist. Nobody had time for a midlife crisis because there was no midlife to speak of. Blink, and you're dust. Except that's not really what happened. And the real story is stranger, darker in some ways, and honestly a lot more interesting than everyone died young. So let's actually dig into why this number, 30, keeps showing up in textbooks, documentaries, and that one uncle who read a Wikipedia article once and now says it at every family dinner. First, let's talk about where this average lifespan of 30 thing even comes from, because the answer is basically a math trick that fooled an entire species for a century. When researchers calculate average life expectancy for ancient populations, they're not measuring how long a typical adult lived. They're averaging the age of death across every single person in the sample, including the ones who died on day 1. And, in the ancient world, an enormous number of people died on day 1, or day 2, or year 2. Infant and child mortality was brutal. Some estimates suggest that in prehistoric and early agricultural societies, somewhere between a third and half of all children didn't make it to age 5. That's not a typo. That's just Tuesday for most of human history. Now here's where the math gets sneaky. Imagine a village of 10 people. 5 of them die as babies at age 0. The other 5 live to be 60. Add it all up, divide by 10, and congratulations, your average life expectancy is 30 years old. But notice something. Nobody in that village actually died at 30. Not one person. The number 30 is a ghost, an average that describes no real human being's actual life. It's a statistical mirage created by mashing together two very different groups. Infants who tragically died almost immediately, and adults who often lived a genuinely long time. This is the single biggest thing people get wrong about ancient life expectancy, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you survived the gauntlet of early childhood, your odds of reaching what we'd now call old age were actually pretty decent. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, both historical ones and a handful of groups that maintained traditional lifestyles into the modern era, found that adults who made it past 15 had a real shot at living into their 60s or 70s. Some lived even longer. There's research on populations like the Hadza in Tanzania and the Ache in Paraguay showing that once you clear childhood, your remaining life expectancy starts looking surprisingly close to what a lot of people experience today, minus the Wi-Fi and dental insurance. So why does the "everyone died at 30" myth persist so hard? Partly because it's a punchy, quotable idea. It fits neatly into a sentence. It makes ancient humans sound impossibly fragile compared to us, which flatters our modern sense of progress. And partly because the raw numbers taken at face value without context really do say average age at death around 30. Nobody bothers to explain the asterisk. The asterisk being, this number is dragged down to the floor by a catastrophic rate of babies and toddlers dying, not by grandma keeling over during her 30th birthday party. But let's not swing too far the other way either, because ancient life was still genuinely dangerous in ways that would make a modern safety inspector faint. Even if you weren't destined to drop dead the moment you hit your 30s, the threats stacking up against you from birth onward were relentless. So let's actually walk through them, because this is where things get grim, fascinating, and occasionally darkly funny in that humans are so weirdly resilient kind of way. Let's start at the very beginning, because birth itself was one of the deadliest events a human being could go through for both mother and baby. There were no sterile delivery rooms, no antibiotics if things went wrong, no emergency C-sections. Childbirth was, for a huge chunk of human history, a genuine coin flip in terms of complications. Obstructed labor, hemorrhaging, infection afterward, these things killed staggering numbers of women in their childbearing years. Some estimates for pre-modern societies suggest maternal mortality rates that would be almost unthinkable by today's standards. something in the range of 1 to 2% of births resulting in the mother's death. And when you consider that women were often giving birth many times over their lives, those odds compound fast. Motherhood in the ancient world was, in a very literal sense, a repeated act of bravery. And for the babies themselves, surviving birth was only round one. The first year of life was an obstacle course of threats. Infections the immune system hadn't built defenses against yet. Malnutrition if the mother herself was undernourished, exposure to cold or heat without the buffer of modern housing, and diseases that a healthy adult immune system could shrug off, but that could flatten an infant in days. Weaning was another dangerous checkpoint. Once a child stopped nursing and started eating solid, often less nutritious, sometimes contaminated food, malnutrition and diarrheal disease rates spiked. Diarrhea, as unglamorous as it sounds, was one of history's great silent killers of children. Because dehydration in a small body moves fast, and there was no such thing as an oral rehydration packet from the pharmacy. If you managed to survive infancy, childhood itself was still no picnic. No vaccines meant childhood diseases we now barely think about. Measles, whooping cough, various pox-type illnesses could tear through communities and disproportionately kill the young. Parasites were basically a universal childhood experience, quietly draining nutrients and weakening immune systems over years. And injuries that we'd now consider minor, a deep cut, a broken bone, a bad fall, could become life-threatening without basic wound care and antibiotics. A scraped knee today is a Band-Aid and a lollipop. A scraped knee in the wrong ancient context could become an infected wound, and an infected wound could become sepsis, and sepsis could become a very short story. So by the time a person reached, say, 15 years old in an ancient society, they had already survived an obstacle course that would make a modern reality TV show look tame. And that's precisely why the people who did clear that gauntlet tended to be remarkably hardy. This is sometimes called a survivorship effect. The population of surviving teenagers and adults wasn't a random sample of humanity, it was a heavily filtered group that had already proven their bodies could handle infection, malnutrition scares, and physical trauma. In a strange way, ancient adults were somewhat like elite athletes who'd already passed a brutal tryout process, except the tryout was just being alive. Now, does that mean adulthood was suddenly safe? Not exactly. There were still plenty of ways to die before old age, they just shifted in character. Let's talk about a few of the big ones. Violence is a huge factor that a lot of people underestimate. Some archaeological and anthropological studies of pre-state societies, meaning groups without centralized governments, police forces, or formal justice systems, suggest strikingly high rates of death from interpersonal violence and warfare. We're talking raids between groups, blood feuds, and conflicts over territory or resources. Estimates vary a lot depending on the specific society and time period, but some research has suggested that in certain small-scale societies, violence accounted for a substantial percentage, in some studied groups over 10% of adult male deaths. That's an extraordinary number when you compare it to modern homicide rates in most parts of the world. Life without an official system to resolve disputes peacefully meant that conflicts often escalated in ways that were, quite literally, deadly. Then there's the ever-present threat of famine and chronic food insecurity. Ancient humans, especially once agriculture became widespread, were incredibly vulnerable to bad harvests, droughts, and unpredictable climate swings. A single failed growing season could mean months of malnutrition for an entire community. And malnutrition doesn't just make you hungry, it weakens your immune system, stunts growth in children, and makes you far more susceptible to dying from infections that a well-fed body could fight off easily. It's a nasty feedback loop. Hunger makes you sick. Sickness makes it harder to gather or grow food, and the cycle spirals. Interestingly, some research actually suggests that the shift from hunting and gathering to early agriculture made health outcomes worse for a while, not better. This sounds backwards, right? Farming should mean more reliable food, but early farming societies often relied on a narrower range of crops, which meant less nutritional diversity. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural populations sometimes shows signs of nutritional deficiencies, stunted growth, and dental problems that are less common in the skeletons of earlier hunter-gatherer groups who ate a broader, more varied diet. So, the agricultural revolution, often taught as this triumphant leap forward for humanity, came with a real biological cost, at least in its early centuries before farming techniques and food storage improved. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Speaking of teeth, let's give dental health its own moment here because it's honestly one of the most brutal aspects of ancient life that doesn't get enough attention. No dentists, no fluoride, no floss, just you, your teeth, and whatever gritty, fibrous, occasionally stone-flecked food you manage to scrounge up. Grinding grain between stones often introduced tiny bits of grit into the flour, which wore down teeth over years like sandpaper. Cavities, abscesses, and severe tooth wear were incredibly common. And here's the terrifying part. A dental abscess isn't just a toothache. Left untreated, an infection in the mouth can spread into the jaw, the bloodstream, even the brain. There are documented cases in the archaeological record of people who almost certainly died from dental infections that a modern root canal would resolve in an afternoon. Something as small as a cavity could, without warning, become a fatal countdown. Infectious disease in general deserves its own spotlight too, because this is arguably the single biggest killer across most of human history. More than violence, more than childbirth, more than starvation. Without antibiotics, without an understanding of germ theory, without vaccines, the human body was essentially fighting every infection on its own, with whatever herbal remedies and folk knowledge a given culture had developed. A simple bacterial infection that we treat with a 5-day course of antibiotics today could, in the ancient world, turn into a fever that either broke on its own or didn't. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal infections, wound infections, these were constant background threats. Life expectancy really took off in the last couple of centuries largely because of public health measures, clean water, sanitation, vaccines, and antibiotics, not because human bodies fundamentally changed. Our ancient ancestors had essentially the same biology we do. They were just facing an invisible war without any of the weapons we now take for granted. Environmental dangers also played a bigger role than most people imagine. Exposure to extreme cold or heat without modern shelter and clothing technology could be lethal, especially for the very young, the very old, or the already weakened. Animal attacks, while probably rarer than popular imagination suggests, thanks to Hollywood cave bear movies, were still a real risk in certain environments. Accidents during hunting, foraging, or even everyday tasks like climbing for food or crossing rivers could result in injuries that, again, without modern medical care, had a real chance of becoming fatal. Okay, so with all of that stacked up against ancient humans, you might be thinking, how did anyone survive long enough to become an elder at all? And this is actually one of the most fascinating parts of the story because ancient humans absolutely did have elders. And those elders were not some rare, freakish anomaly. They played a crucial, well-documented role in their communities. There's a concept in anthropology called the grandmother hypothesis, and it's one of the more elegant explanations for why humans, almost uniquely among mammals, tend to live decades past their reproductive years. In most animal species, once an individual can no longer reproduce, evolution has little interest, so to speak, in keeping them alive because natural selection operates on reproductive success. But human females, and to a lesser extent males, often lived well past menopause. And researchers believe this is because older individuals, grandmothers in particular, provided enormous survival advantages to their grandchildren and broader community. They gathered food, they passed down critical survival knowledge, medicinal plant use, tracking skills, weather patterns, and they helped care for children, freeing up younger mothers to gather more resources or have more children sooner. In other words, living to an old age wasn't some evolutionary afterthought. It was actively selected for because elders made entire communities more likely to survive and thrive. This is backed up by ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer societies, where elders are often treated not as burdens but as walking encyclopedias. Before written language, an elder who remembered where water sources were during a drought decades earlier, or which plants could treat a fever, or how their ancestors survived a particularly brutal winter, was an absolutely priceless resource. Losing an elder wasn't just an emotional loss, it was potentially a catastrophic loss of accumulated survival knowledge for the whole group. So communities had every reason to protect and care for their oldest members, and many did. There's also skeletal evidence supporting the idea that elderly ancient humans were often cared for, not abandoned. Archaeologists have found skeletons of individuals who lived for years, sometimes decades, with severe disabilities. Missing teeth that would have made chewing tough food nearly impossible, healed but severely debilitating fractures, even conditions that would have left them unable to fully provide for themselves. The fact that these individuals survived long after their injuries suggests that their communities fed them, cared for them, and kept them alive well past the point where they could fend entirely for themselves. It's actually a rather touching thread running through the archaeological record, a very ancient form of "we take care of our own." So here's where the picture really comes together. Ancient human life wasn't a flat, uniform experience where everyone had roughly the same short shelf life. It was wildly bimodal, meaning there were two very distinct clusters of outcomes. On one end, you had this enormous, tragic cluster of infant and child deaths, driven by disease, malnutrition, unsafe childbirth, and the general chaos of surviving without modern medicine before your immune system and body had fully developed. On the other end, you had a smaller but very real cluster of people who cleared that early gauntlet and then went on to live genuinely long lives, sometimes into their 60s, 70s, occasionally even beyond, depending on the specific dangers of their environment and a healthy dose of luck. The number 30 sits right in the uncomfortable valley between those two clusters. It's the mathematical shadow cast by combining catastrophic child mortality with a real, substantial population of long-lived adults. Nobody was actually experiencing age 30 as some kind of biological finish line. It's a bit like calculating the average temperature of a room that's on fire on one side and comfortably air-conditioned on the other, and then telling someone the room is moderately warm. Technically, the math checks out. Practically, it tells you almost nothing useful about what it's actually like to stand in that room. Now, it's worth being careful here because this isn't an invitation to swing to the opposite extreme and say ancient life was basically just as safe and comfortable as modern life, just with worse plumbing. That would be its own kind of myth. Adult mortality rates in ancient societies, even excluding childhood deaths, were still notably higher than what most people experience in developed countries today. Violence, infection, injury, and childbirth complications continued to pose real risks throughout adulthood, not just infancy. A 40-year-old ancient human wasn't strolling through life with modern-day safety margins. They were still, by our standards, walking a tightrope every single day, just a tightrope they'd already had a lot of practice on. There's also huge variation depending on which ancient humans we're even talking about, because that phrase covers an absolutely massive stretch of time and an enormous range of environments and lifestyles. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers wandering resource-rich landscapes had different risks than early agricultural societies packed into dense settlements where diseases could spread more easily between people and their livestock. Coastal populations with access to seafood often had better nutrition than inland groups reliant on a narrow set of crops. Climate mattered enormously too. Harsh winters in northern regions posed different survival challenges than tropical environments teeming with parasites and infectious disease. So there's no single, universal, ancient human experience. There's a sprawling patchwork of different risks, different average lifespans, and different odds of making it to old age depending on where and when a person happened to be born. It's also worth mentioning that the archaeological and anthropological methods used to estimate ancient ages come with their own limitations, which is part of why researchers have had to revise earlier assumptions over time. Estimating age from skeletal remains, based on things like bone density, tooth wear, and the fusion of certain skull sutures, gets less precise the older someone was at death. It's relatively easy to tell a 5-year-old skeleton from a 15-year-old skeleton. It's much harder to distinguish a 55-year-old skeleton from a 70-year-old one, because the physical markers researchers rely on tend to plateau. This means that for a long time, older individuals in the archaeological record may have been systematically underaged, further skewing perceptions of how long ancient people actually lived. More recent research techniques have started to correct for this, and the emerging picture increasingly shows more elderly individuals in ancient populations than earlier studies suggested. So, why does this myth that everybody died at 30 idea hold such a powerful grip on popular imagination, even among people who've never read a single academic paper on paleodemography? Part of it, honestly, comes down to how satisfying a clean, dramatic number feels. 30 is round. 30 is quotable. 30 makes for a great documentary hook. Ancient humans faced a brutal daily struggle for survival, with an average lifespan of just 30 years. Sounds a lot punchier than ancient humans faced brutal childhood mortality rates that dragged down statistical averages, though those who survived to adulthood often lived into their 60s or beyond, with significant variation across cultures, environments, and time periods. One of those fits on a title card. The other one needs its own documentary. There's also a psychological comfort in believing our ancestors were fundamentally more fragile than us. It reinforces a tidy narrative of constant progress, that humanity has been on a steady march from misery toward comfort, and that modern life represents the pinnacle of that journey so far. And to be fair, in a lot of ways, that narrative holds up. Modern sanitation, vaccines, antibiotics, and medical technology genuinely have transformed human survival odds in ways that would have seemed like pure magic to our ancient ancestors. But the myth oversimplifies things by making it sound like ancient adulthood itself was short, rather than acknowledging that it was ancient childhood that was catastrophically dangerous, which is a very different and honestly more specific problem. Thinking about it this way actually reframes a lot of what we assume about ancient societies. Elders weren't some rare exotic anomaly. They were respected knowledge keepers who existed in basically every human society we have evidence for. Grandparents told stories, passed down survival techniques, helped raise the next generation, and were, in many documented cases, treated with real reverence specifically because surviving that long was seen as an accomplishment worth honoring. The image of ancient humans as a species where nobody lived long enough to develop wisdom, culture, or deep social bonds across generations just doesn't match the evidence. Human culture, oral history, religious traditions, craft knowledge passed down through apprenticeship, all of that depended on having elders around long enough to teach it. A species where everyone genuinely died at 30 would have struggled to develop the kind of rich, cumulative cultural knowledge we know ancient humans actually had. There's something almost oddly comforting, or at least fascinating, in recognizing that the biggest threat our ancestors faced wasn't some vague ambient, everything is dangerous doom by 30 cloud hanging over their entire lives. It was a specific, brutal, front-loaded gauntlet concentrated heavily in the first 5 years of life. Once you cleared that, your odds actually started looking a lot more favorable, and the rest of your life, while still riskier than ours in plenty of ways, had real potential to stretch out across decades, filled with children, grandchildren, seasons, stories, and the accumulated wisdom of having survived things that would make most of us today faint at the mere description. So the next time someone tells you ancient humans just dropped dead at 30 like clockwork, you can hit them with the actual, more interesting version. Childhood was a battlefield with no modern medicine to help fight it. Childbirth was a genuine gamble every single time. Infection could turn a scraped knee or a bad tooth into a death sentence. But if you made it through all of that, if your body proved tough enough, lucky enough, and cared for well enough to reach adulthood, you had a real shot at becoming one of those gray-haired elders sitting by the fire, being asked, again, to tell that one story about the winter the river froze solid, for what was probably the 100th time. And honestly, when you think about everything stacked against them, disease with no cure, childbirth with no safety net, infections with no antibiotics, that any of them made it to old age at all starts to feel less like a statistical inevitability and a lot more like a genuine achievement. Our ancestors weren't fragile. They were, in a very real sense, some of the toughest people who ever lived, surviving in conditions that would send most of us running straight to the nearest emergency room within about a week. So maybe the real question isn't why so many ancient humans died before 30. Maybe it's how the ones who survived managed to be tough enough to make it all the way through, and what exactly the rest of us might have lost in comfort, in convenience, in modern medicine that made humans that resilient in the first place.